Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining me for this How to Publish with Palgrave session. My name is Phil Getz, and I'm Senior Editor for Philosophy and Religion at Palgrave Macmillan. I'm speaking to you from a beautiful day in sunny New York City, though I do wish we could be in person rather than having a virtual session today, such as it is. Let me just share my screen with you so that you can follow along with the slides that I prepared for the presentation today. Moment. Okay. Now you should see my my name and my email address there, which I'll also be sharing at the end of the presentation as well, but you can feel free to jot it down now. So in today's session, I am going to be speaking about the publishing process, which can seem a bit daunting for those of you looking to publish for the first time. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the process, what you can expect from your publisher, talk a little bit about putting together a successful proposal, give some hopefully useful tips, and advise on revising your dissertation into a publishable book. And I'm also going to give a brief overview of who we are at Palgrave and the type of research that we publish within the humanities division at Palgrave, and talk you through the life cycle of a book project from proposal to publication. And I'll speak for about 20 minutes, and then I'll be providing my email address again at the end on the final slide, and invite you all to get in touch with me. If you have any questions about what I've said, or if you'd like to discuss your project with me, I'll be available this week or any other week if now is not a good time. I am on New York City time, so just be mindful of that in terms of coming up with a time to speak, though there is some flexibility. I can find a time that's convenient for you as well. And I'll be glad to hear what you're working on and answer any questions you have about this presentation or anything that's not covered in the presentation. And all right, so let's continue. So within the scholar division of Palgrave Macmillan, we publish a range of products, including research, monographs, and edited collections. This is the bulk of our program, probably most relevant for our purposes as well. They make up about, I would say, 90% of what we do. We also have mid-length kinds of projects, book projects called Palgrave Pivots, and those are really between the length of a journal article and a full-size monograph, usually between 25,000 and 50,000 words for that format. So if you have work that really is between that length, between a journal article and a monograph, that would be a good format for you. So you can feel free to get in touch with me about any work that might fit that. We also do handbooks and major reference works. These are large edited collections that serve as a reference work, surveying a critical terrain of a particular field or subfield. I'm sure many of you have used these kinds of books in the past. We're always looking for new proposals for emerging subfields and for opportunities for major reference works and handbooks. We also do a selection of professional practitioner titles, trade titles, kind of crossover titles as well to the general audience beyond the academy. We do some upper level textbooks. We do some undergraduate textbooks as well. We also publish journals, and we publish open access publications. Oftentimes, those open access publications are in concert with funding bodies such as the Wellcome Trust or Templeton and others. If you have interest in doing an open access publication, do let us know, because we are very active in that publishing space. So, all right, so I'm first going to discuss some of the things that we look for in a book and in a book proposal, and then I'll go into more detail with regard to the proposal and the life cycle of the book. So the first thing I should say is that we are most interested in original research. So you want to ask yourself before you send out a proposal, is the work original or is it really just derivative? Does the work advance a debate that's ongoing in the field? So much being published and the need to build on existing work is difficult sometimes to be entirely new. Of course, a lot of our work is, written off of the shoulders, on the shoulders of previous research, which is fine, but you want to make sure that your book is offering an innovative study, a new perspective on existing research that's already been published, and that it brings together ideas from different disciplines, perhaps, or discusses case studies that haven't been discussed before. Does it make comparisons it doesn't make comparisons that have not really been engaged in a certain subfield of research. Just try to present your project as original as it possibly can be presented, because that's a very important also for getting an audience for your book. Next is it relevant to an ongoing debate in the academic field? We want to make sure that it's current, that it speaks to a discourse that is lively and timely, rather than something that was discussed and there hasn't really been something written about it in the past, I don't know, 20 years or so. Though if you feel as though there is reason to reinvigorate a certain discourse that has somehow fallen short, that's also an argument to be made. But you want to make sure that you are demonstrating that your book is advancing a certain discourse, or bringing it to a new level of expanded research. You want to make sure that you're doing that you have a clear and persuasive argument throughout your book, and not that it's not so much about just laundry lists of interesting research. You want to make sure that you're saying something new. And this is very important. You want to make sure that it connects with a defined audience. Does it have a large enough audience to support the book? Now, this is an extremely important component for any business, right? To know that there is an audience for what they're putting out. What you want to think about with regard to the audience is, oftentimes people think that their books will be read across so many different fields, which it could be. But you want to make sure that you know what the target audience is, what the specific primary academic audience for your book is, because it demonstrates a familiarity with your own research and with the field that you're working in. So you want to be able to clearly identify who would be interested in working on this. Are they theologians? Are they constructive theologians? Are they comparative theologians? Theologians in a particular field of or comparative theology with particular traditions? Is it more scientific study of religion? Is there a sociological focus within religion? Is it philosophy? Is it a philosophy of religion book? Is it philosophical theology? All sorts of these kinds of things. You want to make sure that you are able to identify who the appropriate audience is. And does the book fit with our list? Now, this is pretty important for you to find the right match, right? You want to make sure that you're going to a publisher that specializes in the kinds of books that you are trying to write. And now, sometimes, if you're kind of trailblazing a field, there won't be a large publishing kind of corpus at any particular publisher, which is fine. But you want to make sure that there's something that is fitting to the publisher that you're going to. It's academic focus, perhaps. It's peer review standards. You want to make sure maybe also the editor in particular that you want to work with is at that press. But be thoughtful about who you approach so that you can have the right kind of match. So, okay, let's move on to one thing before I get into the specifics of the proposal. For most people, their first books will be a revised dissertation, and that can be a bit of a difficult task, right? It can be a bit of a process that you can sometimes feel as though you're really all on your own. Luckily, there are a number of very good books that are very helpful for this process when you're revising your dissertation into a book. And I highly recommend those. I've listed them here. So I recommend you take a look at those as you're doing your revisions. And most of the time, it's just so rare for a dissertation not to require revisions before it becomes a book. And the reason for that is it has a different audience. You know, the purpose of the dissertation is for the dissertation committee. You're writing it for the committee to demonstrate that you are worthy of the degree that they're going to grant upon you. Now, or grant you, bestow upon you and grant you. Now, that shifts when you turn it into a book, because the book is meant to speak to the broader academic world, certainly within your field of research, but it's also supposed to be of use and of interest to researchers and scholars somewhat outside of that immediate purview. And so you want to think about that. You want to have that in mind while you're doing your revisions. And sometimes I should say, the dissertation perhaps is more compatible with a number of different articles rather than revising it toward a book. So you want to think about that, about whether it makes more sense to carve it up into different articles and publish them independently, or whether you actually want a book. I'd be happy to discuss that with you if you want some feedback and explore, what the pros and cons of that are. There are a number of different considerations in that regard. So one thing that you want to do, though, when you're making that decision, is you want to look at published books in your field, see whether they're the kinds of books, whether they focus on the kinds of questions that you're asking in your dissertation. Do they address it in the same kind of comprehensiveness? And you also want to see who is publishing, which presses are publishing books in your field, and you should probably be interested in approaching those, because they clearly are active in your field of research, and so that would fit their list significantly. You want to rethink your content, the structure and the length and the style and the readability of all of this. You want to really tailor it, turn it into something that is really of interest to the broader academic community, rather than for the limited kind of audience that your dissertation is written for. And so you also want to get rid of kind of excessive quotations and documentations, literature reviews, because really what those are there to do is they're there to demonstrate that you've read all of the necessary scholarship in your field. And it's a demonstration of your breadth. But at the same time, once you're publishing a book, it will be assumed that everything you say will have been informed by much of that research. So you don't have to prove anything to anyone anymore. What's most important is that you get your point across and you demonstrate it in the writing. Right? You show and it's illustrative in your command of the literature that you're employing in the course of your narrative. So you want to revise the chapter titles, cut the notes down, cut all mention of the book having been originally a thesis, and you want to write this book, pretend like you've been writing the book the whole time rather than the dissertation. And I can offer you feedback on some of these things more particularly if you want when you get in touch. And always good, this is, writing 101, but we all have to be reminded of it. Always opt for the active voice rather than the passive voice. It is so much more important. It's so much more illustrative, and it can often allay ambiguities that often creep in when you use the passive voice. So famously, the passive voice should be avoided. Now, okay, now putting together a proposal. There are a lot of tips. I mean, we could go on forever about how to put together a very good proposal. Most publishers' requirements for a proposal will be relatively the same. We actually have a proposal template, a form, that I'd be happy to share with you. If you shoot me an email, I can send it right to you. And it actually puts a lot of these, puts a lot of the elements, the components of a proposal in order, so that you can easily see, you can easily just kind of fill out each of the different sections. So it's actually a good exercise, and it is straightforward, and it leads you in the right direction. So the first thing that you're going to have to think about, of course, is the title. Now, the title is very important. You want to make sure that it's as descriptive as possible, because people will be searching for certain terms, and you want to make sure that they find your book when they search those terms, right? So there are a few examples here. These are primarily from the literature list or the film and culture and media list. You see memory and confession in Middle English literature. Very, very clear what this is about. The child in contemporary Latin American cinema. You see all of these terms: child, contemporary Latin American cinema. These are the kinds of things that people will be looking for. American Cinderella, Broadway, sexual revolution. Try to stack your title with descriptive and clear terms that people who are interested in your research will be looking for. So make sure that it's as clear as possible. The description, that's the second part. You should not be assuming any kind of specialist knowledge on the part of the editor. The editor will be familiar with some of the research, but certainly not as much as you are, most likely not as much as you are, because they have to be on top of research across different fields. So you want to provide a broad overview that clearly speaks to what your research is about. Think of it as what we call a 5-minute elevator pitch, right? Something as succinct and clear as possible to someone who you don't assume has read the literature. And so try to use the kinds of terms in effective ways that display what the book is about. And also included in that description should be a point about your key argument. What is the book about? What is your key argument? How is it distinctive? And what does it offer that the competition, the comparable titles in the field don't say? Now then there is the content element. This is where you're going to provide the table of contents. And you should also provide detailed description of each chapter. The whole thing should be around 300 to 400 words. 300 to 400 words for each chapter. Be very helpful, kind of provide kind of an abstract type of form for each chapter. And you should also include 2 sample chapters from, at least 2 sample chapters from the book in order to give a sense of how the book is written. And that will be very important for the peer review section. All right, let's move on to the next slide. The market. Now, the market is an important thing to think about, as we were talking about earlier. It's related very much to the audience. Now, the most important thing to recognize is that the market is always going to be limited in some way, right? There's going to be a parameter to what the likely market is. And every editor on earth loves when an author is very clearly headed about what the market for their book is. What is the primary market? Are they the theologians? Are they that audience that we were talking about earlier? And is there a secondary market? For instance, if you are writing an interdisciplinary work, some kind of theology that incorporates history. So your primary audience might be the theologians who write on what you write about, but there might also be historians of religion as well who would be interested in it, and that would be considered a secondary market. So you want to make sure that you're writing it and that you're writing it toward that market, and that you can show the editor that you know what that market is, because it shows that you really have an understanding of where your book fits. Where your book fits. Now, the next part, the competition and the comparable titles, that actually demonstrates who your interlocutors are, right? Which discourse you're contributing to, what the corpus of literature contains already, and who you'll be really interacting with intellectually. And so people often misunderstand this part of the proposal. They think that if they put in too many comparable titles or competition titles, that the publisher, the editor, will be concerned that there's too much oversaturation in the field, and so you should be kind of careful about the kind of competition that you mentioned. That's actually not true. The whole point of the comparable titles is to show that there actually is a lively and vivacious discourse in what you're writing about, so that it actually encourages an editor to be interested and to think that there will be a likely market for the book. So it's very important to put on who you think are the most directly relevant titles and authors for the book. Titles and authors, people who have written similar kinds of research. Next, these are kinds of things that you can kind of get into a little bit more when you're actually doing the manuscript preparation for the book. 1 second here. There we go. Falling off a little bit here. Okay. Now, third-party materials. That's something just to be concerned about, or just to look into while you're preparing the manuscript. You want to make sure when you're writing the proposal that you acknowledge any kind of third-party materials, like large illustrations or large extended quotations that might require some permission for use from the original publisher or the rights holder. This usually shouldn't stop anything from happening, particularly in the academic world. You just want to be mindful of it and note whether there are any kind of significant third-party materials. This is really just to sift out the kinds of projects that contain a tremendous amount of this kind of material, to the point where it starts to be unclear whether it's really a new work. And so just be honest about it. And then if it doesn't work for that particular publisher, they'll usually be able to tell you who else to go to, what kind of where this kind of work might be most appropriate. And then there are some technical details. The extent is the length of the book. So how many, usually in thousands of words. Don't use pages, because that is a relatively subjective unit of measurement. It depends on what your margins are, what your spacing is. So just say how many words the book is, when you would be able to presumably deliver the final manuscript. So how far along you are in the process. That's what it gives us an indication of, so that we can plan out the production schedule in some way. And then it asks you for contact details so that we can get in touch with you, of course. Now, so I highly recommend that you go through all of these tips again as you're putting your proposal together. And you can get in touch with me at any time if you have any questions about it. I'll be happy to answer them. But the proposal is a very important part, and the revised 2 chapters are really going to be the meat of what is evaluated at that early stage. So let's go to the life cycle of the monograph. Now, as I said, you put your proposal together, and then you submit it to an editor, right? You find the editor who you're most interested in working with. There's usually information about this on publisher websites. You can find them, and you should contact them directly. They'd be interested to hear from you, and you want to tell them what you're working on. Make your email pretty succinct. Hi, I'm very interested in publishing my monograph with you. I've attached a proposal and sample material and my CV as well. And the editor will take a look at that proposal, and they'll look through it and make sure that they think it's really ready to go out for peer review. And if they have any feedback for you, this is what we refer to by the top-level editorial work between the editor and the author. They'll give you some kind of general feedback, think whether it's really ready for evaluation by your peers. And once they do think that it's really in good shape, they'll send it out for peer review. That peer review process can usually take between 2 to 3 months, sometimes less, sometimes more. It really depends on the efficiency of the reviewer. So you can sometimes wait a little bit longer depending on the situation. For instance, if there's a pandemic, sometimes that could affect things a little bit. But you can feel free to follow up, but just be a little bit patient, and you know that the process is still is going forward, even if you don't hear anything necessarily for a while. Once you receive the peer review, once the editor receives the peer review, they will give that peer review a very significant read. Now, the peer review will fall into one of 3 categories. The first category, of course, is a recommendation to publish either as the book is or with minor revisions. I should also say, by the way, if you have more than 2 chapters to share at the time of the proposal, you can feel free to share as much as possible, as much as you want. At least for me, I mean, some editors might prefer not to have that, not have as much material at the proposal stage. Excuse me, sorry. But I generally think that more material, the better, because it can be evaluated at that stage. For revised dissertations, though, I do recommend that it'd just be the 2 chapters, and you can share the thesis as well, though it won't be evaluated as the actual project. You want to do those revisions for a couple of chapters and then send them out for review to make sure that you're on the right track, rather than doing the whole thing and then sending out the entirety of the manuscript and getting a response back that really it wasn't going in the right direction, this revision, and then you have to do it all over again. It's good to kind of like do a stopgap, do a couple of chapters, get your feedback on that, and then you can incorporate a lot of that feedback into what you're going to be revising in the other chapters as well. So if the review comes back positive, then the editor will send that review to you, or several reviews. It can sometimes be between 1 and 3 reviewers, really depending. And they'll send the review to you, and they'll ask you for a formal response that notes how you plan to incorporate the suggestions that are made. And once they receive that response from you, they will bring that. I would bring the project before our editorial board for a kind of formal approval process. All of our books go through this process. It's really a check and balance system once we have positive reviews. And at that point, we would offer you a contract for the book. Now, if the review comes back, as I said, it could fall into one of 3 categories, and a recommendation to publish with as-is or minor revisions is the first option. The second option is a recommendation to revise and resubmit. They say that generally the project is good in principle, but it requires a little bit more work. So in which case we would share that review with you. And if we agreed with the feedback, we would encourage you to make some changes to the proposal and perhaps to the sample material, ask you to send it back to us, then we'd send it out for peer review again. And that's the resubmission. And hopefully if you've incorporated those changes that we thought were necessary, it'll usually generate a positive review at that point, and then we would continue the process as I've been describing. The third option, of course, is something that would never happen to anybody who's watching this session, which is the recommendation not to publish this manuscript, that it's really not a good fit. But we can talk about that if that ever happens as well. Okay, so the contract, we'll send you the terms of the contract. They're relatively standard across the board for most academic monographs or edited collections, also for major reference works. There are some general standards for each format, and there's not that much flexibility, but you can ask here and there about maybe small changes to potentially, if you would like a let's see some examples of things that you could request. One thing you could request is if you wanted a particular language if you want to hold on the rights to a particular language because you have interest in publishing it in that language yourself. There are pros and cons to holding on to that kind of right, because we also have a translation department that sells translation rights, and then we split that amount with you. So it might be in your interest to have those rights stay with us so that we can then advocate and try to sell those rights for you, and so you might get some income from that. But we can discuss that when the time comes. Now, once you have the contract will include when you plan to deliver the manuscript. And so at that point, once you get the contract, you're going to be preparing the manuscript for that date. So you're going to be doing any kind of revisions that are necessary, any kinds of tweaks. If there's new research that's come out that you want to incorporate, that's what you do. But we want to hold to the delivery date that is stipulated in the contract, which will have come up with you it'll be a reasonable date, and sometimes ambitious, but reasonable, and takes into account your schedule and how much revision you think really needs to be done, and what we think needs to be done. So once you're putting all of the manuscript preparation together, we'll have also sent you some guidelines, formatting guidelines, that we would like the manuscript to be in, the form that we want the manuscript to be in when you send it to us. We'll also send you some permissions forms that you will use to acquire any kinds of third-party permissions that I mentioned earlier, third-party permissions from other publishers who have already published material that you want to incorporate. Sometimes you won't even need any permissions, but oftentimes you will. It's not rare. It's a very common thing, and oftentimes for academic kinds of works, you won't have to pay. Sometimes if they're illustrations, certain kinds of material, you might have to pay for some of those permissions, and that usually does fall on the author. And it's also a good exercise to decide whether you really need that material, whether it's worth paying for. So, but you can ask us if you have particular questions about those kinds of things as well. And then you deliver the manuscript. We will usually, if there have been significant revisions requested, we will usually send the final manuscript out for another set of review pre-publication to make sure that that all of the issues have been addressed. Nothing else new has come up. It's really very much a quality assurance type of review process. We call it a clearance read. And it usually doesn't hold things up. Usually takes around the same amount of time that the original peer review process. Sometimes it takes even less, especially if we send it to the original reviewer who is already aware of the project and knows what to look for. Now then, the manuscript enters our production phase, which usually takes a few months, usually 5 months, and that's where we produce the cover, copy editing and proofing and all that kind of stuff, where the book is actually put together and produced, like every book you've ever read in your life. And usually the publication of the ebook will predate the print publication by just a bit, sometimes a week, sometimes a few days, not that much, but it will sometimes be a little bit quicker, which is kind of helpful because then it means it's available and for consumption, for use, particularly in situations like this, where people aren't going to physical libraries as much and they can access it online. Okay, so that is the life cycle of the monograph, and eventually that's when it's published. If you have any other questions about this, it's relatively nice, straightforward, step-by-step process here, but do feel free to ask me any questions about it if you have them. Okay, next, so some things that you can do when you publish your book with Palgrave. You can track your book through all stages of production. You'll be getting an account called your My Palgrave account, and you'll be able to follow it through various stages in production. You'll get an author badge that you can use to promote it on social media. You'll be able to download the ebook copy of your book, and we ask that you not share it with anyone, of course, because obviously that can cannibalize sales, and it's not good for you, it's not good for us. And this account will also allow you to kind of manage all of your previous Palgrave books. Now, I just keep this slide in here because just to show that we are very committed to the humanities as a publisher. We are running a campaign for the humanities we've been doing for the last several years, which means we participate in various humanities oriented and promotional initiatives. We establish collaborations with humanities centers and departments in different places. We sponsor various kind of public facing interactions between academics and the wider audience. We do various events that are related to the humanities. And oh, I actually didn't even realize I must have put this this little campaign for the humanities article that I wrote not so long ago with regards to the humanities and COVID. So you can actually find that. I imagine if you Google some of those terms, you can find that pretty easily. So anyway, so this is just to demonstrate our commitment to the humanities as a publisher, and especially at a moment when humanities departments are being defunded in many universities, losing funding to the sciences, and we're still committed to it. So that is the presentation, and I'm very glad that you've all joined me for it. I'd be interested to hear about everything you're working on, so please do feel free to get in touch with me, and I'll also be glad to share with you. Any our proposal form, the template proposal form that should be very helpful for producing and putting together your proposal. And also just feel free to get in touch at any stage in your research, and I'll be glad to speak. Wishing you all a very safe and healthy summer and time this week. It is a highly irregular moment in all of our histories. So wishing you all the best. And thanks very much for joining.